And good morning from Washington, D.C. I'm Paul Kincaid, Director of Congressional Outreach for FMC, the Association of Former Members of Congress. Thank you for joining us today for this discussion of the Democratic general election campaign here in 2020. This is an interactive discussion today, so if you have a question at any time, simply click the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, fill out your name and your question, and if we choose you, our moderator will call on you to ask your question over audio only to our panel. Again, anytime during the call, just click the Q&A button at the bottom center of your Zoom screen. We're looking forward to a wonderful discussion between yourselves and the co-chairs of our congressional study groups on Germany, Japan, Korea, and Europe. Together, they represent a tremendous reserve of experience, both in Congress and in democratic politics. While no one has seen an election quite like this, we know their wisdom will be able to provide as much context as anyone can right now. You've all seen their bios, so I'll just run through them quickly. Congressman Ted Deutsch has represented coastal Broward County in Florida since his election in 2010. He's the co-chair of the Congressional Study Group on Germany. Congresswoman Diana DeGette heads up the Congressional Study Group on Japan, and she's represented her seat in Denver in the Denver area since her election in 1997. Congressman Peter Welch has represented the entire state of Vermont since his election in 2007. He's the co-chair of the Congressional Study Group on Europe. And Congressman Ami Bera is our newest co-chair, representing the study group on Korea. Congressman Bera has represented the 7th District of California near Sacramento since 2013. Our moderator today is no stranger to many of you, particularly those who have participated in FMC programming before. Former Congressman Bart Gordon served Tennessee in the House from 1985 until 2011. He was chairman of the Science, Space, and Technology Committee during his time in the House and helped write the landmark Competes Act that created tech jobs and education in the United States. He's now a board member here at FMC. We want to thank him and all of our panelists for taking time out today to discuss what has become a unique election. Congressman Gordon, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Paul, and welcome everyone. Let me give a couple of thanks, and then I want to get right into this because we've got an excellent panel today and some important issues to discuss. First, I want to thank all the participants that are joining us, and we really have a long list. And many of those are either from our study groups or they are from the Business Council. And let me tell you that it's your support that allows us to do these and other types of meetings. And also we have several former members of Congress that have joined us. Our leader, Martin Frost, old timer, Dennis Eckert, really the profiles in courage, Marjorie Margolis. None of you were here when Marjorie made that long walk down. Well, I guess you were, Diana. That was so important. And so Marjorie, sometime maybe we'll have a program with profiles in courage with you. Another old timer, Norm Mineta, Larry Smith, Peter Smith, the other Bart Stupek, and Al Wynn. Thanks for joining us. So let's get right into this. And again, I will give my thanks to our 4 co-chairs for their, we know they have a full-time day job and they have an interesting date coming up in November, but you still give us a lot of time, and thank you. Now, I may be a little bossy here because I want to sort of move things through, but I want to start with Peter. Peter, we had a nice conversation the other day where you talked about how things were different, both the camaraderie in the House as well as the what you're doing at home. And so I'm going to direct questions towards someone, but anybody who wants to add to that, please go ahead. So Peter, start off. Got to unmute, Peter. Peter, unmute.
Got it. Can you hear me?
Got it.
Are you hearing? You know, 2 things. COVID has made a huge difference, and we're just not interacting and we're not there. In some ways, it doesn't matter enormously because COVID came in March, and we did that first huge package that was bipartisan, negotiated between Pelosi and McConnell, and that really stabilized the economy. But since then, all of us have been basically at home and not doing the interaction, and we're watching the continuing negotiations on the second aid package. But the second, obviously, you know, is the Trump effect. There's been in the House for quite some time, but also a real desire on the part of many members, both sides of the aisle, to work together. Speaking candidly, I think it's really, really tough in this era where a Trump tweet guarantees that a Republican colleague who crosses the line can likely face a primary. And then the issue in that primary is whether who's the most supportive of President Trump. So that's a hard challenge for our colleagues. And what it's meant is that on the lower than top tier issues, there's some capacity to work together. But at the end of the day, when we get to the major questions in a resolution on a major issue, it tends to become party line. So I think that's regrettable, and we'll see if things change after this election. But thanks, Bart.
Anyone like to add anything to that?
I mean, I'd only add as the member with the shortest tenure here, the one thing you really do miss is that ability to interact on the House floor, where you can go across, find a Republican colleague and kind of work things out on pieces of legislation and so forth. It's a lot harder to do over the phone and over Zoom, and it's just not the same. There's an element missing right now.
The other problem is of necessity, because we have to socially distance when we vote. We've sort of gravitated towards doing these big omnibus bills, or even when we do another bill, we do an amendment. I managed an amendment on the floor last week that had 91 individual amendments in it, an amendment to the energy bill. And so what that does is it increasingly puts the power in the speaker's office to develop these bills, and you really do miss that collaboration, and even on smaller bills between Democrats and
Can I just add, though, that my colleagues are right, Bart, on how this has impacted what happens in DC. I know, though, in a strange way, I have, because of the challenges that we face and because we're home so much, I have spent more time on a regular basis with our local elected officials, county commissioners, mayors, city council members, understanding the very specific needs that they have. My hope was, since I know my colleagues are seeing that too, that might actually cause a greater willingness to overcome the challenges that Ami in particular talked about. Unfortunately, it hasn't yet, but I think we feel very plugged in. I at least feel very, very in touch with what's happening on the ground during this whole pandemic.
That's what Peter was saying the other day, and how he missed interaction in Washington, but how it was fun to shift to the district and have that kind of interaction. So Ted, let me switch to you. Besides being on Foreign Affairs and on Judiciary, somewhere you made the speaker really mad because she made you the chairman of the Ethics Committee. So I'm sorry for that, but somebody had to do it. So
it's true.
We all know that in all likelihood, the way Florida goes, so goes the nation in presidential elections. And there's been a lot of discussion about early votes, how the president is discouraging write-in, how Democrats are trying to encourage, not write-ins, but absentees, and that the president has a better ground game. I also have a real concern that Democrats will, I'm getting feedback here, I don't know what that is, but Democrats may load a lot of early votes and mail-in votes, but they, by a larger percentage, are thrown out. So what are you seeing, since you are on the ground there, what are you seeing in Florida in terms of absentee ballots, in terms of early voting, in terms of the ground game?
Sure. It is true, as you point out, that what happens in Florida always plays a significant role in determining the election. The president needs to win Florida, or it's virtually impossible for him to get reelected. I can tell you right now, I actually was just before this, I was on a call with the county commission. I phoned into the county commission today to talk about all of the ways that vote by mail has already impacted things and the need to have more drop-off locations. I mean, we've seen tens of thousands of votes that are already in In Broward County alone, the vote by mail requests stands at over, I think, close to about 525,000. We're voting in Florida. This isn't an election that's coming soon. We're in the middle of voting right now, and there's a focus on getting it done safely, getting votes in, and making sure that they do count. There is a massive effort on the part of lawyers down here to make sure that no votes, but there's no voter suppression. So I'm just, when I look at the enthusiasm, yesterday's the perfect example. The president got some attention for leaving the hospital to go back to the White House and take off his mask, sparking a lot of commentary about how important it is for us to wear masks. I know that wasn't his intention, but at the same time that he was doing that, I was with Dr. Jill Biden in South Florida, who was doing an event last evening after Vice President Biden spent the day in South Florida near me doing events. There was real enthusiasm on the ground. I think people sense that there is an opportunity to change the direction of our country. And in Florida, whether it's seniors, whether it's immigrants, whether it's people of color, whether it's people who simply want some focus on decency again, it certainly feels like Vice President Biden has a lot of momentum here.
Can I ask Ted a question? Ted, usually with the early voting and the mail-in voting, the Republicans send in their ballots earlier. What I heard is that in many parts of the country, the Democratic early voting is very, very strong. What's going on in Florida?
No, that's a really important question, Diana, and that's the strong support that we've seen and the big margins that Democrats have in early voting speaks to the enthusiasm about the Biden campaign and about the election. So you're right, and there's a reason. Again, we're having a conversation about this presidential campaign. There's a reason that the president, unfortunately, spends so much time trying to sow confusion and discord when talking about vote by mail and absentee ballots. We've done it this way in Florida for a long time. The president has voted this way in Florida and understands that that in the time of a pandemic, this is how so many people are going to choose to participate in our election. And his efforts, at least in Florida anyway, I think are falling on deaf ears. There is real enthusiasm and people are out there participating.
Let me go a little inside baseball. In the 26 years that I was in Congress, I think at least every other week we would have a caucus, and the caucus would be much the same. The progressives would say, if we're going to, win elections and we're going to get people enthusiasm, we have to be bold. The more moderates would say, hey guys, I had to be a Republican to get here. I'm the one that's allowing you to be chairman who walked the plank. And to the best of my knowledge, nobody's mind was ever changed, but we would have that on and on. So when we look at this coming election, Charlie Cook is saying the Democrats are going to pick up from a half a dozen to a dozen, and that really changes to the better almost every week. And so if that occurs, two things are going to happen. A lot of the new members are going to have to beat a Republican to get here. Then you're also going to see new members that are going to take Elliot Engel's place, and some, are winning through the primaries in safe districts. So it could make this, I'll just say, conversation within the caucus more difficult. How are you seeing that play out in this coming Congress?
Well, Bart,
Can I?
Go ahead.
Oh.
I was going to say, Bart, you just are anticipating the bedlam that awaits us. I actually, I mean, and there's a real potential for that because some of the members who've won did win in Republican districts and they've got a much more moderate electorate. And some of the Democrats won in Democratic districts and won a primary. And really it was on a case that the Democrats got to be more progressive. But here's where I think we have the opportunity, you know, and it is going to take significant leadership and restraint. There's been such a absence of policy that has been advanced in the Congress in the last 4 years. I mean, as you know, essentially, especially this last term, legislation passes the House and it dies in the Senate. And it's legislation on justice and policing. It's been legislation on environment. It's been on healthcare. And, you know, we can have a debate about Medicare for all versus a public option. But the point is that there is so much fertile ground where if we're smart, we can put together legislation that provides meaningful benefit to all the people we represent on those issues that cut across democratic lines, on energy policy, on climate, on racial justice. And there'll be a lot of fighting in the House, but the opportunity to do something that's really meaningful as opposed to just token, I think gives us the potential to be successful. And that's obviously depends on having a Democratic Senate and a Democratic president.
I
Dan, I
agree
think
with
you wanted to say something. Then
I agree with Peter. I do think we have a wide range of philosophies within our caucus, but I also think the core of the caucus are sort of center left. And I think some of the shared values that we have, which is improving the ACA, instituting a public option at a very minimum, and shoring up the coverage under the ACA, improving healthcare for people, reducing prescription drug pricing, all of that. Also, climate change. I think we have a real consensus within our caucus across the board that this needs to be done. And Peter's right, we will have some back and forth about how far do we go with this, but we will have some. So I think we'll have some pretty significant changes. I just want to give you one example of how the Democrats have really changed in Congress, Bart, since when you started in Congress and since when I started in Congress. I'm the co-chair of the Congressional Pro-Choice Caucus. And this year we have 207 members of the pro-choice caucus. Contrast that with the last Congress where we had 180 members. And we have, for the first time ever, a pro-choice majority in the U.S. House of Representatives. Virtually all of them are Democrats. But when earlier this year, we were whipping Democrats on some edgy choice issues. And even Democrats from some of these districts, Bart, that you talked about, sort of the red to blue districts, former Republican, now Democrat, these members said to me, I'm pro-choice, my constituents all know it, and I vote pro-choice. And so that's a real sea change in philosophy than even when you were there. And I think you're seeing that with climate change, with healthcare, with a number of other issues, energy policy.
And Bart, if I were just to add to that, so I do the political side of the New Democrat Coalition. It's 104 members now, the largest we've ever been. And the vast majority of the seats that we picked up in 2018 came in these moderate districts that have swelled our membership. And of the 10 to 15 seats, and I think we will pick up more than 10 seats, potentially up to 20 seats, those are all going to be New Dem seats that are, you know, kind of pro-business, pragmatic Democrats that understand that we have to try to put bipartisan legislation together. So if you look at how Speaker Pelosi's legislated in this Congress, if you look at HR 1 through 10, those are not super left bills. Those were bills that could be broadly supported by the caucus. They're widely popular with the electorate, you know, on campaign finance reform, gun violence legislation, you know, and, you know, shoring up the ACA, attacking prescription drug prices. I imagine that's going to be our initial agenda. You know, how do you not take those bills that are actually pretty well thought through bills, broadly supported by the caucus, and move them forward. And the last thing I'd add is, even if we do pick up the Senate, and I think we will pick up the Senate, it'll be a small majority. And you look at a Joe Manchin, you look at some of the folks that are in a Steve Bullock. If we pick up Montana, we're not going to be able to pass legislation that's so far left that it goes nowhere in the Senate. We're going to have to pass legislation that those folks can support, and I think that is in HR 1 through 10.
Ted, you want to add anything to that?
No, I'm happy to move on. I have thoughts on everything, of course, Bart, but I'm happy to move on.
No, Bart, you're muted.
Me? There's good news and bad news in that it may be more polarized, but when I was first elected, Tip O'Neill was speaker, and he had a 75 or 100, sort of margin. So he didn't, there was no whip operation. Just do what you want to do. We'd always get a few liberal Republicans, where you've got half that now. But if you can get another 10 or 15 and have a civil conversation with as much homework as the committees have done, I think it will be a very progressive and productive time. So let's get into, since a lot of our audience are from the various country study groups, Japan, Korea, Europe, and Japan, Korea, Europe. You're Japan, you're Korea, Germany, of course, for 30 years.
Germany, yes, Germany.
So what are you seeing as a difference in foreign policy initiatives? Let's assume that there is a Democratic trifecta, as Ami said, with a narrow Democratic Senate. What do you see as the foreign policy changes and initiatives?
Well, Bart, I'll start with this one. The most important change, and I think this is critically important for our friends who are joining with us today on this. I think the most important change, if we have a new president in particular and a Democratic Congress, is rebuilding American leadership in the world, showing our allies that we can be trusted partners, rededicating ourselves to being a leader on the global stage, leading with the kind of commitment to our values and human rights that America has been known for. I don't think we can take for granted the fact that there has been this sea change over 4 years, and I hear about it in every conversation I have with ambassadors and with business leaders from around the world who want to know that America is going to re-engage, because this isn't just a decision made by America. If we're not engaged, if we're not leading, then there is a vacuum to be filled, and it is a vacuum that the Chinese are only too happy to jump to fill. It is a vacuum that the Russians, in many ways, have been invited to fill. So I think that there will be a concerted effort, starting from the White House, but certainly with the support of the Foreign Affairs Committee that Ami and I serve on, and Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and Appropriations Committees, and all the rest, Armed Services Committee, to reassert American leadership for good with our allies around the globe.
If I were just to play off of Ted, we know a potential President Biden's approach is going to be a multilateral approach, and whereas Trump has taken a very bilateral approach. I think immediately we'll be rejoining, the Paris Climate Accords. We'll be rejoining WHO. We'll be sitting at the table with the Global Vaccine Alliance, trying to figure out how we address this pandemic. And those are all places where we're absent. And I think that'll happen, immediately, on day one or in that first week where we're rejoining. And the world is looking for the United States to be back at the table in partnership. And there really has been a void these last 4 years.
I've been working with the Biden campaign around Japan policy, and I think Japan is a really good example of the Trump administration's very shallow foreign policy. So former Prime Minister Abe, he very shrewdly contacted President-elect Trump right after he got elected. He went and played golf with him, and the entire U.S.-Japan relationship was based on a personal relationship between Trump and Abe. Well, now, of course, Abe has left, and we've got the new Prime Minister Suga in Japan. But at the same time, U.S. foreign policy in Japan has really eroded. Donald Trump put steel tariffs on. He refused to try to, of course, we pulled out of TPP, but then he didn't really do much for the Asia Pacific region to try to come up with an alternative trade agreement. At the same time, China was asserting its dominance in the region. And we haven't even had a U.S. ambassador in Japan for over a year because Bill Hagerty resigned to go run for the Senate for Lamar Alexander's seat. And so I think what we can see under a Biden-Harris administration is a much deeper and, as Ami says, a wider U.S. foreign policy. And let's not forget, when Joe Biden was in the Senate and when he was vice president, some of his primary assignments were to interact with foreign governments. So he has deep knowledge of the governmental leaders around the world. And I think that the administration is going to work very quickly to, as both of my colleagues said, to reset foreign policy.
Peter, let me pivot just a little bit with you. You're the only member here on the Intelligence Committee. So don't tell us anything you'd have to kill us, for, but give us sort of a idea how this trifecta could impact our intelligence operation and those important issues.
Well, fundamentally, the real concern that we have in the Intelligence Committee, at least on our side, is the politicization of intelligence. And we've been reading reports, so I'm not disclosing anything that is from being in the committee. But there's a clear, heavy influence by the Trump administration of political appointees essentially insisting on getting the intelligence that they want and suits the Trump narrative. And that's a consistent theme throughout this presidency, that we just saw Mark Meadows basically order the CDC that it should change guidelines in order to accommodate a rush to a virus before the election. So that line that both sides, in my experience in Congress, have abided by, that there's limits on what you can do with political engagement in the policy work, is different in the Trump administration, because those folks who are serving, say, in the intelligence community have been there for a long time, or in the CDC, are written off as, quote, the deep state. So I think the biggest challenge we would have in intelligence is to try to restore the respect for the mission of intelligence and its sacrosanct place as being about providing information to the policymakers as opposed to providing political cover for the policymakers. And then going back to what I think the foreign policy will be, I think everyone has said it, but Ted phrased it pretty well. It's engagement versus isolation. And we have to engage. And the issue that is going to be continuing is one where there's bipartisan apprehension about, and that's the role of China in the emergence of China. And the argument for engagement is that in order for us to be successful with an advocacy of traditional US values that are by and large been bipartisan embraced, is that it's to our advantage to be engaged, for instance, with Europe in order to be a bulwark against overreaching on the part of China. So I'm excited. I mean, if we get that, I'm really quite excited about re-engagement.
Yeah, Bart, if I could just add, Peter touched on China, and I get the privilege of chairing the Asian Pacific subcommittee, and we really have strategically been thinking about how we create more multilateral coalitions as we engage China. And in some ways, China's actions are speeding that coalition, whether it's Australia, Japan, United States, India, other like-minded allies. And the last piece, Peter touched on the importance of the transatlantic relationship. We never really married the transatlantic and the Indo-Pacific relationship and strategies together. And that's something that we have been talking about and thinking about as we go forward. Again, the pandemic, China's behavior, China's aggressiveness really is also accelerating those conversations with our European allies in a very different way than even a couple of years ago.
Okay, lightning round. Raise your hand if you think we're going to get another COVID bill within the next week or so. Well, that doesn't.
You're muted again, Bart. You're muted.
I said I hope Peter's right. I think I can see all of you, but it was 3-1 no. So let's talk about lame duck. And again, we have a limited amount of time, so let's take Ani's trifecta approach. So we know probably what won't get done in a lame duck. Tell us what you think might get done in a lame duck if we're looking at a narrow margin in the Senate, President Biden, and an increase in the number of Democrat House members. Diana, you're the deal maker. What do you think will get done?
I think that under your scenario, obviously we will we'll do the appropriations bills, or we'll do another continuing resolution. I frankly am not sure how much more will be done by then. We need to do the NDAA reauthorization. There's a number of the House just passed an energy bill. I think we need to look and see some of the senators who are either retiring or will be retiring as chairs of their committees. They may have some priorities that we could make some deals on energy policy. There's a group of us that have some big wilderness bills and public lands bills. We might be able to make a deal with Lisa Murkowski. But generally, I love your perspective because you were there for 26 years. In a situation where you have a sea change of government, there's not going to be much incentive on the Democrats' part to start cutting deals because they know that they're going to have the full gamut in January.
Lamar is going to be very important.
Yeah.
Be important in terms of what he can put together in the Senate. So it's going to be sort of one of those unanimous consent. But I think there has been homework done, and I think there can be some things. Ted, anything on you?
Yeah, I actually think that it's more likely that we'll do a COVID relief bill before the election than that we'll see anything significant in a lame duck session. I mean, the president in the midst of his tweeting from Walter Reed on a number of medications, who knows what we read into these tweets, but there was some encouragement from him to get a deal done. The speaker, who's been masterful, I think, in negotiating with the administration, with Mnuchin, if the president clears the way for and tells his members of Congress, the Republicans in the House and Senate, that it's a priority. It shouldn't be about polls. And for us, obviously, we saw what was going to happen when the benefits of the CARES Act expired at the end of July, which is why we passed the HEROES Act. It's why we came back again this last week and took action. It shouldn't be about polls. But politically, because we're all in politics, if you look at the series of polls that have come out today, yesterday, and especially today, the president has to look at that and realize if he's going to have any chance at all, he's got to do something that shows he's on the side of the American people. And this COVID Relief Act is about all he's got. So I'm more hopeful that something might happen, maybe not in the next week, but in the next couple of weeks before the election, than I am after,
right.
Because after we're going to be getting ready for what comes next.
I just agree with what Ted said. the one variable here, I'm a classmate of Mark Meadows, and I think if it was left to Secretary Mnuchin and Speaker Pelosi, they'd get the deal done and they'd get it across the. I think Meadows is the new variable in there.
Okay, another lightning round, and then we're going to go to questions from the audience. Who, raise your hand if you think we're going to have earmarks in some new, well-done way. Raise your hand in the next Congress. Okay, for the audience, it is 3-1. And so, Ted, you don't get that new road. Sorry.
I didn't say that it makes sense. I didn't say that we should recognize that members of Congress are in the best position to understand what the needs are in their districts. I'm just suggesting that when push comes to shove, look, I'm on the side. I'm with my colleagues on this, but when push comes to shove, politically, I think it's going to be a challenge for some members to do that.
Well, to do it the old way, and let the Science Committee authorize, and then let the appropriators appropriate. That might work out. So now, Paul, I think we have some questions. Would you mind putting those up so we can move to our patient audience?
Yes, sir. Our first question comes from Ton Vu of the Vietnamese Embassy, who has a question about what our panelists think about the possibility of President Trump getting reelected. Ton, go ahead and unmute your microphone and you can ask your question.
Thank you very much. I'd like to have a question for Mr. Warren. Do you think that if Biden gets elected, he will do? Do you think that if Biden gets elected, he will not be able to end the trade war as suggested by a recent foreign policy article? And how will Biden act towards the TPP or towards the CPTPP? Thank you.
Well, two things. I'm not quite sure I got totally the first question, but I think I'd put my money on Biden at this point. The polls are saying that, and I think people need a change. Trump has surprised us before, and he's got a loyal base. And the question this year is whether polling is accurate or it's off like it was in the last election. But second, I think that Biden will be pro-TPP, and I think there'll be a bigger argument that some Democrats will listen to, and I'll listen to this myself, about how that plays not just the trade role, but a foreign policy role. And that was an argument, as you remember, that President Obama started, I think, hammering towards the end of the effort to get PPP through. So I would see us in the effort to re-engage and to have allies in the effort to contain's not the right word, but to compete with China, that would be an accelerator for PPP.
And let me just add vis-a-vis TPP. We had pretty much negotiated the deal, and then politics intervened in the 2016 election, and both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump rejected TPP. But what happened after that, of course, was Japan went ahead with a treaty with other countries in in the Pacific region, and also with Europe. And as I said, that is really hurting the US in many ways with trade, and it's helping China increase its power in the region. So I also agree, we do need to look at negotiating a comprehensive trade deal, but we have to overcome the barriers, the labor conditions in some of the countries, and environmental conditions. We're going to have to seriously undertake that again before we can really get an overall deal.
Paul, any other questions?
Yes, sir. Former Congressman Peter Smith has a question about the climate the policy will be written on in Congress in the next session. Congressman Smith, if you can go ahead and unmute your microphone, you can ask your question.
Sure. Thanks so much, Congressman Gordon. This makes me very uneasy. So I'm not suggesting it's what we should do, but I find the prospect of confirming a Supreme Court justice in the circumstances we're in to be wholly inappropriate, to put it mildly. And I found myself thinking, could there be a sequence in which the Congress would pass a bill saying that no new Supreme Court justice can be appointed after the 1st of July. And at the same time, having passed that bill, is there a way to recall a Supreme Court justice? The larger question is, I think all of us have been at home for a year now, or will have been. And I think the slow motion we've seen of politics, as well as the climate of security for people who are vulnerable, I think there has been a significant change in the way people are thinking about the humanity of their brothers and their sisters. So I sense that there could be a very new middle of the road position for moderate to liberal politicians. I'm a recovering Republican myself, so I have to take that into account. But I put both of those together because both of them would have been, I think, sort of unthinkable 5 years ago. But I see a new climate, and I would love to have my friend and former colleague Peter Welch tell me what he thinks.
Well, Peter, it's so good to hear your voice. I wish I could see you. I'll be quick so that my other colleagues can weigh in. I think that the question of this Supreme Court justice has got to be put in the context of the breakdown of some of these institutions that have served us well to protect minority rights, but now we have a situation where we don't have majority rights. You know, fundamentally, a democracy is majority rule with protection of minority rights. And what we've seen is the Electoral College throws that out of balance. The lifetime appointments of the Supreme Court that many would argue puts them beyond appointment by the succession of presidents of both parties. So I think there'd be some movement, not so much to pack the court. I don't think that's really going to be an option, but to perhaps have term limits that are lengthy, like 18 years, but to try to have a setup where there will be an opportunity for presidents of both parties to have an appointment. Also, I think there'll be more of a discussion about the Electoral College. So this challenge we have where we've consistently seen the minority in control in a democracy, I think is of concern. Second, I think you're really right about COVID, because what we have seen with COVID is that the lack of the basic social insurance programs that are necessary when bad things happen through no fault of the people that we represent. We don't have the childcare system, and we have frontline workers who have to work and have no way to take care of their kids. We don't have family leave. 5 million people lost their health care, employer-sponsored health care, when they lost their jobs. So I think there is enormous space for us to have a serious conversation about how do we in this country have a social insurance program that's going to be a safety net for people when catastrophes like this happen. Thanks, Peter.
If I were just to add on to what Peter said, this is a moment in time, right, where you've had 3.5 years of a president playing on the divisions in America, and then throw on top of that the pandemic, the real suffering that's happened to many communities, the healthcare inequities, the economic inequities that are out there. Throw on top of that the murder of George Floyd and the social justice movement, the generational tensions that are at play. And I think there is an opportunity for all of us as leaders to try to step forward and heal this country. I do think, and you know, Vice President Biden says this in his own terms, that he's going to try to reach out to Republicans, you know, post-Trump, and see where they are and where the party is, you know, in a post-Trump world. I don't think he's going to take the approach to just jam the Republicans and marginalize them in the Senate. But I also think a lot's in how Mitch McConnell approaches this. If he approaches it the way he did Barack Obama, saying we're just going to oppose to get back in power, then yeah, I don't think we have any choice other than to set them aside and do things on our own. But there is an opportunity to come together. as a country.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I think that Peter's point, the second point especially, is a really smart observation. We all remember the early days of the pandemic, and before wearing a mask was politicized, and before things went over the cliff. There were in those early days so many times when we recognized that we were all in this together. It's the reason, fast forwarding to where we are now in the context of your other question, Bart, by 3-1, people think Congress should be taking up a relief bill before the Senate moves forward on a Supreme Court justice. And to Ami's point, it's that sense that we had that people recognize how interrelated we all are, and what happens when a health crisis happens, and what it exposes, the challenges that we need to face together, that that Joe Biden is speaking to. I think it's the reason his message of unifying the country is so compelling to so many. So that is a really smart point, and I think it actually permits us going forward with the kind of leadership that President Biden would offer to really get things done and to bring people together to do it.
So, Paul, any other questions?
Yes, sir, Congressman. We've got two more. There's an anonymous question that came in on one of the phone lines that wanted to know what our panel thinks about the potential of President Trump denouncing the election results and trying to stay in office.
That may be President Trump called that one in.
Well, frankly, that's the plan. All right. I mean, give President Trump credit. He's not coy about this. In the whole Postal Service, when we were trying to get money to the Postal Service, partly to facilitate the vote by mail, the president, in his own words, very explicitly said, hey, we don't give the Postal Service money, they won't be able to get the mail ballots out. So he's been doing this. And we do have that dynamic, which I think all of us are worried about, where you'll have the early votes counted, and then the mail-in votes will come in slowly. And there could be, in those early votes, a Republican orientation without the counting of some of the mail-in votes, which a lot of people think would be more Democratic. So there's a real significant potential for that mischief. There really is.
And I will say this, though, the Democrats have, unlike in 2000, when we can let Ted talk about Florida in 2000, but the Democrats are aware, and we've been preparing for this for a long time, to the point that Nancy Pelosi has now started saying and directing efforts because Donald Trump has now signified that he actually may try to take the election to the states and have the electors in the states chosen by the Republican state legislatures, and then come to Washington to try to give him the election, even if he loses. And so the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee has actually now started focusing on trying to win state legislatures in some of the states so that the Democrats can have control over a majority of the states. I frankly think that that's a very sad state for the American political system to be in, to have a president who's trying to cut funding to the Postal Service so people can't get their ballots, and then trying to suppress the vote by saying they're going to challenge legitimate votes, and by telling his supporters to keep an eye on voting to try to suppress the vote. But I also don't think it's going to work. As we're seeing, we have a huge number of people who are voting early. I think we're going to have a massive turnout on Election Day. And Speaker Pelosi said it best: what we have to do is we just have to win, and we have to win decisively. And then I think that I think it'll be impossible for Donald Trump to claim victory. We may still have to remove him physically from the White House. I don't put anything past that guy, but at least we need to win definitively. We can't be relying on a few counties in a few states to determine whether Joe Biden will be the next president.
Let me give a quick clarification on what Diana was talking about. if there's not a determination by a certain period, then Congress will make the determination as to who is the next president. But it's not a matter of everyone having a vote. It is a matter of each state will have a vote. So if you had, 5-4 in one state, then predominantly you would think they would vote with whatever it is. Peter, is the guy in Vermont. And so right now, there are 2 or 3 more Republican states with a majority than Democratic states. And so there's a real effort to try to win. There's about half a dozen states where either a single member of Congress or you need to win one more. So there's a real effort not to want to use that, but to have a stopgap in case it comes up.
Thank you.
And Congressman, we have one more question from former member Dennis Eckert. Congressman Eckert wants to ask a question about President Trump's discussion of law and order. Congressman Eckert, go ahead and unmute your microphone and you can ask your question.
Hello, everybody, and I appreciate your service. And Bart, it's good to see you again. There were too many times we were chasing that elusive 218th vote, and I'm sure we all appreciate that. Ohio is in play, which is good for all of us. We have 6 polls in a row, just to share with you, that now has Biden up, but it's only 2 to 3 points. That's not my issue here, though. The issue is Donald Trump's siren song of law and order, and the conflicting view that we are seeing amongst folks who may support us on justice and equity issues, but are anxious about what they have seen taking place, in some cases provocatively by folks on the right, of unstable neighborhood and street scenes. So I'd like to ask the members who are home, to what extent do you think this law and order pitch is working? And is there anxiety between folks who support the cause but are nervous about what they're seeing on television? Thank you.
Yeah, so I'd say back here in Sacramento, there is real support for, some of the demonstrations and rallies, and a lot of that enthusiasm is coming from a younger generation, and it does feel different. But there is, also some angst and concern about, some of the rioting and looting and, smashed windows that we see downtown. By and large, the rallies and protests have been relatively peaceful and so forth. But I think the vice president's certainly handled it very well, talking about the importance of peaceful protest and, the ability to drive social justice and change, but to do it in a peaceful way, and that the respect for law enforcement. And I think there's a balance there. And I would just add, the measures we took up in the House with regards to police reform are widely and broadly supported, I think, across the public. So I think there are places to start.
Ted, you're the swing state. So what's it going to do?
Look, first of all, I don't know that Dennis, I've ever had the opportunity to thank you. It was when I was a student at the University of Michigan that I had the opportunity to travel on down to Northeast Ohio to campaign for you at a polling place all day long with your opponent. I think which made me realize this was such fun. I want to do it myself one day. So thanks. Look, I think Florida's not unlike other places around the country. The president is trying to create an issue that doesn't, a campaign issue that isn't real. Look at the debate last week. Look at the way Vice President Biden talks about the police. Look at his record. He's not in favor of dismantling police. He's and the president stood on stage and kept telling him to say law and order, say law and order. And Vice President Biden repeatedly talked about his views on law and order. It was absurd, but that's all he had because he didn't want to talk about his response to COVID and the failures to take action when he knew how deadly it was. So there was an effort to do that. I can tell you in Florida, that effort I don't think was successful before, but with the president contracting COVID, there is now no talk of that. The focus is almost entirely on COVID. And just today, we have a governor, it's important to note, who has taken the same approach as the president, which is to pretend that this isn't serious. He's reopened our entire state. And just today, the positivity rate in tests in our state is back above 5% for the first time in a while. So that's what people are focused on. They understand where the president stands. Police reform, responding to the necessary cries for racial justice is something that has broad support. Suggesting that that's going to mean dismantling the police was just a failed political argument, I think.
Ted, I'm glad you're successful because, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say very quickly, I think that was the president's hope that he could push this law and order agenda. But I think that the wind was totally taken out of it when Joe Biden said, hey man, you're the president. This is happening under your watch, and under my watch, we're going to reduce the tensions. I don't think that argument has worked.
Okay, our time is running out. Ami, what are the 2 or 3 top priorities for the new Dems in the next Congress? And then Dana, tell me, I know you'll be trying to put some big deal together. I want to know about that.
Yeah, the initial things that we're going to have to focus on are obviously the domestic response to the pandemic, and then rebuilding our economy, the economic response. So, infrastructure, jobs, if we do climate, that should also be a jobs program as well.
Dana, what's your big objective?
I think we'll pass a climate bill, and also I think we'll pass some provisions shoring up the ACA. And of course, I have 2 or 3 bills I'm working on, including an update of my 21st Century Cures bill with Congressman Fred Upton, Republican, of course, from Michigan.
Ted, what are your priorities?
There's the growing bipartisan realization every place except in Washington that we need to seriously address climate change. And my hope is that same bipartisan spirit will actually make its way up to Washington. And the same thing, I represent, like so many members of Congress, I represent a district that endured a horrific mass shooting in a school. And we know what the country wants us to do to take action on gun violence, and I'm confident that that's actually something we'll be able to do. It'll make our community safer, and that's something we should all try to get accomplished.
Congress is a lot more fun when you're getting things done. So Peter, what's going to be fun for you this next year?
Well, all of the issues my colleagues mentioned, but the big challenge is restoring faith in democratic institutions. That's what's been eroded. And our capacity to address all the problems that have been mentioned depends on having some confidence that it's for real and that there are norms and there's restraint. So if the Democrats get the trifecta, we'll have that whole array of legislation that we've been working on. But it's going to be very, very important for us to act with the restraint that we say has been absent. And it's going to be very important for us, even though this is unlikely that we'll get a lot of bipartisan cooperation, to do every single thing we can to reach out and make a genuine effort to include our Republican legislator colleagues. They may say no at the end, but it can't be because there wasn't a sincere effort on our part. I see that as essential to restoring some faith in the institution itself, which is necessary to enable us to address these incredible challenges.
We're coming to the top of the hour. Let me thank you for being a part of this. And on behalf of all the other former members that are listening or watching today, one of the great things about, I think, being in Congress was looking around at the talent of the people that were there, the sincerity, and seeing our co-host here today just renews that with me and makes those memories great, and so grateful that you're there. And because it's tough to be there now, raising the money, doing all you have to do, it's tough. And so thank you, and thank you for being co-chairs for FMC, and goodbye to everybody.